Hi everyone, it's me, Sue Zimmer, your friendly neighborhood science tutor at the Student Success Commons at YCCC. Today we're going to go over the skull bones and structures for Anatomy and Physiology 1 with Helen Manser. It's spring 2020. So I recommend, if at all possible, you have the skull out in front of you, or at least have the textbook in front of you, so you can reference it at the same time as me. So we'll start with the frontal bone. The frontal bone is right here on the front of the skull. It has a few structures. We have the glabella, which is right here between the eyebrows. So the glabella, right between the eyebrows. We have the supraorbital foramen. So the supraorbital foramen is this hole above the eye, sort of on the eyebrow region. So think supra for above, orbital for eye, foramen for hole, supraorbital foramen. The next bone that we have to cover in this class is the parietal bone. So I'm going to turn the skull around. The parietal bone is right here on this aspect, the superior, like the top of the skull. It's like right here on me. So on the parietal bone, we only need to know two sutures. Here's the front of the skull again. We have the coronal suture. So the coronal suture right here, I always think of it as the sun. It looks, corona kind of means sun. So it's like this circle part here, the coronal suture. And then you have the sagittal suture. So the sagittal suture goes right down the middle here on your parietal bone. So sagittal suture, coronal suture, parietal bone. Next up, you have the temporal bone. So your temporal bone is going to be on the temple. So sort of where your ear is, right here. So your temporal bone is right around here on you. So you have that on both sides, of course. On the temporal bone, we have a few structures to go over. We have the squamous suture. So it may be hard to see the detail on the video, but the squamous suture is here. And it's here. So the squamous suture on you would be about here. Next up, you have the zygomatic process. So the zygomatic process, let's turn it. It's this structure right here, right here. There's a little line right here. So it's not this part in front, it's this part right here, this part that's more posterior, right here. Then you have the mandibular fossa. Now, on our skull in the Student Success Commons, the mandibular fossa actually has this piece of plastic in it. So when you put the skeleton together, it sticks together. The ones in the lab don't have this piece of plastic in it. It's just like a little dip. So be aware of that. I'll try to get it real close. But right there is the mandibular fossa, right here. And you've got one on both sides. Next up, we have the external auditory meatus. Some people call the external auditory meatus the external auditory canal. Helen will usually accept either one of those names. So basically, it's this hole in your ear. You turn it sideways and see it right here. Right here. That's the external auditory meatus, or external auditory canal, whichever name you prefer. This big hole right here. Next up, you have the styloid process. Now, I always think of a stylus, which is like a pen, when I hear this, because this structure looks kind of like a stylus. So the styloid process, I'm just going to turn it. You can probably see this part that's sticking down right here. That's your styloid process. So this is the styloid process. Next up, you have the mastoid, which is right here, right there. And then after that, you have the stylomastoid foramen. So the great thing about that one is there's a lot of hints about where it is in its name. So it's stylomastoid foramen, which just means it's the hole between these two right here. So I'll get my pointer because it's really small and get it up really close. So we're on the side and turn it, and it's right there, that tiny, tiny hole right there. It's probably really hard to see on the camera, but right here. So you have a styloid process, the mastoid. The stylomastoid foramen is this tiny little hole between the two. After that, you have the jugular foramen. So I'm just going to take his cap off. And the jugular foramen, I'm going to, so we're like this. I'm going to turn it. We're going to look inside like this. So we're looking on this internal aspect of the skull now. I'm going to put this pipe cleaner into it so you can see it well. So that's the jugular foramen. So it's outside of this big hole. So it's outside of it, not inside of it. And then I'll show you it from the other view. So here's your skull. I'm going to flip it. And you can see the pipe cleaner going through the jugular foramen. So again, it's outside of this hole. It's not inside it. It's outside of it. So when Helen labels this on a test, she'll usually just put a pipe cleaner right through it. And so you can pick it up and you can look at it from whatever view that you like to look at it from. So you could look at it this way for your jugular foramen, or you could look at it this way. Next up, you have the carotid canal. So the carotid canal on our skull in the Student Success Commons looks a little bit different from your carotid canal on the skull in the lab. So you have to spend time with our skull and their skulls, because Helen could pick any skull that she wants to test you on. So you want to be familiar with it on all of them. So on the skull in the Student Success Commons, you can actually only see the carotid canal as a little dip, and you have to move it like this. So here's the front of my skull. I'm going to turn it over like that. And your carotid canal is going to be right here, right here. So let's see. Here's your jugular. And then right above the jugular, you can see the pipe cleaner is through the jugular right now. Right above the jugular is this little dip, and that's your carotid canal. So jugular foramen, and right above it is carotid canal. And as I said, in the Student Success Commons skull, you can't see the carotid canal on the other side, on this internal aspect of the skull. But in the lab, on many of the skulls, if not all of them, the carotid canal goes all the way through. So you're going to want to spend time in lab being sure that you can tell the carotid from the jugular, because that can trip you up very easily. So I'm just going to put his cap back on. So the next bone that we're going to go over is the occipital bone. So the occipital bone is going to be on the posterior aspect of the skull. So I'm just going to turn it around. Here we go. We're turned around now. Here's the back. So this is the occipital bone right here. So it's the back of your head. It's the back of your skull right here. So the occipital bone does have a suture. I'm going to try to get you to see it. It sort of starts here and it goes all the way down and over. So that's the lambdoid suture. That's the lambdoid suture. It's all around the back. Next up, you have the foramen magnum. So here's the front of the skull. I'm going to take his cap off again. Good thing about the foramen magnum is it's pretty easy to identify. We can look at it like this. So here's the front. I'm going to look at the inferior aspect of the skull. Flip it up. There's the foramen magnum. So it literally is just a big hole. And then here's the front of the skull. We're going to look at the internal structures. Flip it up. There's the foramen magnum from that view. So again, if Helen was going to label that, she's probably just going to put a pipe cleaner through it. And you should always pick it up and hold it in your hands no matter how confident you are. Funny things happen when we take an exam. We get anxious, and just pick it up and hold it, and don't be afraid to move the skull around during your exam. As long as you don't take out the pipe cleaner, you'll be fine. So next we have the occipital condyles. So here's the foramen magnum. Here's the foramen magnum. Bring it close. The occipital condyles are these right here on the side of the foramen magnum. Right here. They're kind of flat and smooth. You can only see them from this view. So you start here, just flip it up. Foramen magnum, occipital condyles, right there. Next up, you have the hypoglossal canal. I'm just going to take a second to put a pipe cleaner through the hypoglossal. So the hypoglossal canal is going to be very close to your foramen magnum. Here's the front. I'm going to look at the internal structures of the skull. Here's the foramen magnum. So your hypoglossal canal is it's on the side here of the foramen magnum. Now be very careful. A lot of students mix up the jugular with the hypoglossal canal. So make sure that you can tell the difference between the two. I'll show it to you from the other view. So there's the hypoglossal canal. So here's the front. I'm going to turn it. Here's the inferior portion of the skull. Here's my foramen magnum. Here are my occipital condyles. Here's my hypoglossal canal. Now, the jugular is right here. So you can see how, the jugular is right here, right next to it. So you can see how you could easily mix up the jugular with the hypoglossal if you're not careful. So, do it again. Hypoglossal canal, which is sort of within the foramen magnum. Last up on the occipital bone, we have the external occipital crest and protuberance. Let's get this out of here. So the external occipital crest and protuberance, here's the front of your skull. I'm going to turn around, go over to the occipital bone. Bring it really close. Right here is the external occipital crest and protuberance. Helen just has that as one big structure. So she labels it here, she labels it here. All of these bumps are the external occipital crest and protuberance. Now we have to do the sphenoid bone. So here's the front of your skull. I'm going to tilt it this way so that you can see it right here. So the sphenoid bone, it looks like a butterfly, or you could say it looks like a bat. It's this portion here in the back. So the back, not here, just this butterfly region. Has lots of little holes in it. It's a tricky one. So you have the superior orbital fissure I'll put a pipe cleaner through it. It's basically like this little crack inside the eye. See where the pipe cleaner is through? The pipe cleaner is not through that circle hole. It's through this fissure right here, superior orbital fissure. And so if you look at it from this way, you can kind of see it right here under the greater wing. So that's the superior orbital fissure. You have it on both sides, of course. Then you have the sella turcica. This is the sella turcica. It's like a little saddle right here. This part, sella turcica. Next up, you have the optic foramen. I'm going to put my pipe cleaner through the optic foramen. It's just a little circle hole inside the eye. So you see the fissure there, and the optic foramen is the circular hole next to it. If you look at the other side that doesn't have the pipe cleaner, you see the little circle inside the eye. That's the optic foramen. The fissure is the slit next to it. So that's your optic foramen, the little circle. It does start on the other side next to the sella turcica and make its way through to the eye. But of course, Helen always labels it with a pipe cleaner, so you can just pick it up and look at it from whatever angle you like to look at it from. Next up, we have a series of little holes that might be really hard to see on this video, so make sure you try to at least have out your textbook. They're foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen lacrum, foramen spinosum. That's really hard to remember, so if you can remember this mnemonic, run on sand like crabs. That will help you learn where they are in the skull. So every one of those letters, R for run and so on, stands for the second word in that list of holes. So like the R of run stands for rotundum, the O of on stands for ovale, and so on. So that's foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen lacrum, and foramen spinosum. The C stands for the carotid canal, which is helpful for some students to know where the carotid canal is in this series of holes, just as another reference point, even though the carotid isn't on the sphenoid. So that's what the crab stands for. Let's see. So when you learn it, usually the best way to do it, so here's your skull, here's the front of your skull. I'm going to turn it over. Here's the internal structures of the skull. Before you even learn the names, sometimes it can be helpful to just have memorized the mnemonic and to be able to say it in a specific order. So here's like the front of my skull, like the nose and the eyes are here. Occipital bone is down here. Here's my sella turcica. So the first hole is right over here. So it's run on sand like. Run on sand like. Run on sand like. Run on sand like. The lacrum one, is the most medial. It's this big medial hole. Run on sand like. And again, the C stands for carotid, which you don't really need, but it's on the other side of this skull. That might be helpful for you for the skulls that are in lab, but on this one in Student Success Commons, it doesn't really help. So that's foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, and foramen lacrum. Those are really tricky, and Helen usually tests you on it, so make sure you know them really well. And I know that was probably really hard to see on the video, so use the Skull in Student Success Commons or Open Lab in your textbook to get all of that put together. So finally, we're just going to do one more bone for this skull video. It's going to be the ethmoid bone. So here we are again. Here's the front of my skull. I'm going to turn it, looking at the internal structures. Here in the back is the sphenoid bone that looks like a bat or a butterfly, whichever you prefer. Up top here, so here's the frontal bone. So up top here, sort of behind the frontal bone, is the ethmoid bone. So this front aspect right here. So on the frontal bone, you have some structures. You have the crista galli, which is right here. It's just this little crest here. So right here, this is the crista galli. I'll point to it with my pipe cleaner. This little crest is the crista galli. Then you have the cribiform plates with olfactory foramina. So foramina meaning little holes. So if you look closely here, you have the cribiform plates with the olfactory foramina. So those are right next to your crista galli. So they're the little tiny dots right next to the crista galli. Next up, you have the perpendicular plate. So to find the perpendicular plate, look at the front of your skull. Look at the nose. This top part is the perpendicular plate, the top part. This bottom part has a different name. So the top part right here is the perpendicular plate, right here in the middle, not this, the top part. That's the perpendicular plate, the top part only, not the part that juts out towards you, just the straight line. That's the perpendicular plate. Then you have the middle nasoconchae, which is really going to be difficult to point out on a video, but if you look inside the nose here, we have these two like flaps almost. And the middle nasal conchae is kind of misleading because the middle nasal conchae is this top flap, if you will, like this little protuberance, this right here. This top one within the inside, that's the middle nasal conchae. You can see it on both sides. So that top one right inside there, that's the middle nasal conchae. So that's going to be it for this video. Good luck. Happy studying.